Here's one from an NT wife. Wanted to know how to help her ASD level 1 husband to be a better parent. Well, let me ask you a few questions. Have you micromanaged him in the past, and how did that go? Have you told him what he was doing wrong in the past, and how did that go? And with tasks that weren't emergent, have you wanted things done on your timeline rather than on his? How did that go? And have you wanted things done according to your standards rather than his? How did that go? So I'm asking you those questions because if you are parenting him too, then he's going to feel like a child and he's not going to really feel confident in being a parent. So how can you help him be a better part of the kids' lives? Well, don't set him up for failure. So let's say, for example, that your son wants dad to throw a ball around on a Saturday morning, but you know that he's exhausted from a tough week at work. So you can kind of protect him in a way, your husband that is, from looking like a bad parent by explaining to your son that he needs to sleep a bit. And so in this way, you're kind of not necessarily making excuses for your husband, but you're kind of going to bat for him in a way. Another thing, you can talk your husband, talk him up in front of the kids, brag on him in front of the in-laws, in front of his friends. Again, if he knows you're out there bragging on him, he won't want to let you down, period. Another thing to consider is when you're both with the kids, let him be the star. Instead of piping in with directions and ideas for him and the children, let him guide the moment. So as you give your husband opportunities to prove himself, he'll feel more confident as a man and as a father. Another thing to consider is if your husband really feels like you believe that he's trying to be a good dad, he's more likely to live up to your expectations. On the other hand, if you think you have pegged him as a bad dad, he might feel defeated and unmotivated to even try. And I guess the other thing I would say is don't guilt trip him. If you do say things like, well, you should have done this, or why don't you do that? You never he might buck up and not make the time for the kids just to spite you. So he might not know, how to be a good dad, but you can help him and let him take care of the kids more on his own without micromanaging him. That's all I have to say about that. We could take a deeper dive on that at some other time. Here is a question. I'm just kind of summarizing. How can I help my husband to follow through with more of my expectations? Okay. Well, what I would suggest there is do a little bit of end of the day feedback. And so this is kind of a report card delivered to your, in this case, ASD level 1 husband in the form of a text, and I would suggest voice to text. So in this end of the day feedback, you're providing feedback regarding his contributions or lack thereof. Now, this is exclusively for these ASD spouse who is not sure what he's doing right and what's appreciated versus areas where improvement can be made. And he's open to your feedback. If those two things are in place, I wouldn't do this. So at the end of the day, you're going to text him regarding what he did right, along with a few words of appreciation, and also things that need to be worked on. Let's say things that need to be worked on rather than things that you did wrong or areas that you failed. So let's say, for example, let's say that he cooked dinner that night. So you could say, in your end of the day text to him, you did a great job with dinner. I appreciate you cooking a few times through the week. I like how you handled the kids when they were fussy about completing their homework. I thought it was very nice of you when you came home from work and you came straight to me and said, how was my day? So you're saying all the positive things that may have happened first, then you're going to follow it up with some recommendations for improvement. The sink needs a little work. We need to remember to lock the back door before we go to bed too. So in this way, you're starting with the positives, and you want to shoot for no less than 50% positive feedback and no more than 50% recommendations for improvement. I would also avoid using the term you, Y-O-U. Instead, use phrases. So instead of saying, well, you did this or you didn't do that, I would just say, it would be helpful if this happened, or such and such could use a little work. So in summary, end of the day feedback, you're going to text him the 1 or 2, maybe 3 things that you appreciate that he did right. And then you follow that up with a few areas of things that need to be worked on. So that would be a way to get more compliance with him regarding meeting some of your expectations. Let's see. I have another question here about how can I make peace with the fact that I have to do all the relationship work? I don't want you doing all the relationship work, let alone make peace with it. So I would say if you feel like you're doing all the relationship work for you, this was a question from an NT wife, less work is better, okay? If you feel that you're doing all the relationship work, maybe it's time to think in terms of less is better. So you could think of effort involving doing or avoiding. So on one end, you're working on doing something, but on the other end, you're working on avoiding something. So working on something takes a lot of time and energy. I'm recommending that you back off on that. Avoiding something does require discipline, but not much time or effort. So think of it like this. We have 2 categories of poor doing. 2 categories of poor doing. There's doing that yields no positive result. And then there's also poor doing that actually makes a bad problem worse. So with this idea in mind, you're trying to avoid the negatives. So rather than you're trying to avoid the negatives rather than exert some course of action, lecturing, arguing, pleading, negotiating, fixing, reasoning with, etc. So what I would say to do is, kind of as an assignment, list those things that you've been doing or saying that yield no positive result or make a bad problem worse. And then from that list, pick those things that you're willing to avoid doing or saying. I'm not saying, well, just give up and never do anything, but I'm saying pick your battles carefully. And if you feel like you're doing all the relationship work, that means you probably have been doing all the relationship work, which means that he doesn't feel like he has to do anything because the good old wife will take care of it. So when you start backing off some, it's more likely that he will start getting up to bat and doing more on his end, at least more so than he is now. This is from a guy on the autism spectrum, and I'm going to just summarize basically what he's asking. He's basically asking, he says, my NT wife accuses me of having an anger control problem. And he says, yeah, and honestly, he agrees with that. And he's wanting to know what he can do about his anger. Well, first of all, it is exceedingly common for people on the autism spectrum to have anger control issues. And that is largely due to a lot of unpredictability in their life. If you have ASD level 1, you have mind blindness, emotions blindness, some executive function deficits, and anxiety. And often that is just a rough way to live life. And sometimes the result is anger, which is always a symptom of something underneath. So if we want to look at what to do with your anger, we have to recognize that anger is like an iceberg. And when you see the tip of the iceberg, that's the anger. But underneath, as you probably know, the iceberg is much larger below water level. It's 10 times as big as the tip. And so anger is a symptom of something. That's the first point. So we need to look at what is driving that anger, because it's not the core issue. It's a symptom of the core issue. So it could be anxiety. It could be maybe you just feel vulnerable in the emotional sense. Maybe you're going through some type of grief or depression. Maybe you have been hurt, perhaps even from childhood, by being on the receiving end of so much disapproval through your, as a child and teenager, and now as an adult with your NT wife. It could be a self-esteem issue. Maybe you feel powerless at some level, and so your anger is a way to try to regain some power. Maybe there's a lot of fear going on in your life, and so you cover up that fear with anger. So let's look at anxiety first, okay? So our bodies interpret anger as a threat to survival, okay? And as a result, we will release adrenaline, noradrenaline, cortisol, cortisone, all the fight or flight chemicals. And these hormones act as an analgesic, okay? So in effect, anger makes us feel better in the short term, but it numbs our emotional and physical discomfort, okay? It's analgesic. It helps us feel better in the short term because it numbs our emotional and physical discomfort. But this is not healthy in the long term. In fact, most often it's destructive in the long term. So as people on the autism spectrum, those who are on the spectrum and have ASD level 1 or 2 or 3, you would do well to not allow yourself to get addicted to this kind of painkiller. Yes, anger can be addictive. If we do, then outbursts of anger become a way of life, a daily occurrence. And sad to say, for too many people on the autism spectrum, it's already become a way of life. So I mentioned earlier that anger might hide emotional vulnerability. So some people on the autism spectrum use anger as a way of distancing themselves from their, in this case, an NT spouse. So perhaps we feel safer if our spouse is held at arm's length, so to speak. And maybe we find it hard to express our true personal needs and desires. So learning to relate positively to your spouse by allowing yourself to be vulnerable to her and to trust her to respect your feelings, which in most cases she will be a way for you to address your emotional vulnerability that results in the anger that you wanted to ultimately fix. Could you be going through some type of grief or depression? I'm going to adjust my screen there a little bit so I feel like I'm in the roof. Are you going through some type of grief or depression? So that would be something to look at too. Some people on the autism spectrum respond to grief and depression by getting angry. So this can be their way of coping with the pain they're feeling. They may yell, lash out verbally instead of seeking comfort, or instead of offering comfort if our anger is on behalf of someone else. So if you find that you're lashing out, and we would call that misplaced anger, you may want to take a step back and ask yourself, is there something that I've lost, some sense of loss, something that I've lost that I'm grieving the loss of? Anger also hides hurt. So admitting that we feel hurt is too much for some people. It affects their pride and their ego, and they're not about to admit that so-and-so hurt me. So better to explode in rage than to show that we care or that we're upset by whatever has happened. Hurt hides behind anger when we feel unloved, rejected, criticized. It's not uncommon for people on the autism spectrum to have been on the receiving end of teasing, bullying, rejection, ridicule. To some of you out there who can identify with this, do you remember the high school days and all the teasing and harassment and bullying that hurt? But you didn't want to show that hurt because it made you feel even more vulnerable. So if we think our anger is hiding hurt, we should focus on learning to accept that we are wired differently. We aren't wired wrong. We're wired differently. Two different things. Could it be a self-esteem issue? A person on the autism spectrum who's been experiencing anger control issues for many years may admit to himself, if not to others, that he oftentimes struggles with self-esteem. In fact, it is not uncommon at all for me when I'm working with people online specifically the guys with ASD, oftentimes their sense of self-worth is in the toilet, quite honestly. And he may have internal dialogues that revolve around any minute now, somebody is going to insult me. I'm at work and now I'm expecting somebody to say something that I will download as being critical. And so these internal dialogues can occur even in someone who leads an outwardly successful life. Sometimes this inner dialogue or self-talk is what drives us to achieve, quite honestly. So I'm going to prove these people wrong. They think that I'm incompetent. I'm going to go the extra 10 miles to prove that I am. But so, yeah, if you're doing a lot of compensatory things, trying harder, working harder because you don't feel like you're good enough, and you have to be perfect and you have to operate at 100%, that's a sign of low self-esteem, which might be driving your anger. Could it be a sense of powerlessness? Again, as I mentioned earlier, with mind blindness, emotions blindness, executive function deficits, anxiety, sensory sensitivities, and so on, we have so much unpredictability in our life that we, in order just to keep from going crazy, we have to create as much predictability as possible. How does that usually happen for somebody on the autism spectrum? He will have a bunch of rules. He'll crave structure. He'll thrive on routine. He will hate change. He will especially hate surprise change. He will want to stay hyper-focused on his special interest as an anxiety reduction strategy. And when you're hyper-focused on your special interest, you're also hiding from the world because you feel like you don't have any power or control. Is that what's going on? Because if it is, that's going to come out as anger. Lastly, we should probably talk about the difference between anxiety and fear. Anxiety is, I'm afraid of something, but I'm not sure exactly what it is. Fear is, I'm afraid of something and I know exactly what it is. So the most common feeling that hides behind anger is fear. But unless we are developing a habit of mindfulness, which is making ourselves aware of our emotions as they arise, it's going to be real hard to identify the emotions lurking beneath your anger. So our best indication of what those emotions may be is to consider how we feel about ourselves at the time we are not feeling angry. Does that make sense? So in summary, if you have an anger control issue, it's most likely driven by fear, perhaps the thinking error that you don't have any control over circumstances. Could be a self-esteem issue. It could be a childhood issue where you were rejected, ridiculed, criticized as a child. Maybe your parents viewed you as a problem child. Maybe your teachers viewed you as a problem student. And maybe now your NT spouse is viewing you as, insensitive, uncaring, selfish, narcissistic, and so on. So you've been on the receiving end of disapproval for so long, there might even be a sense of shame involved, which comes from toxic guilt. Healthy guilt is, I did something wrong. I recognize it as a mistake. I don't intend to do that. I'm going to learn from that mistake and not repeat it. Toxic guilt, which I find this a lot in people on the autism spectrum, they feel like they're always making mistakes. They're always making social errors. They're always messing up, which leads to toxic shame, which is because I make all these mistakes, therefore I am a mistake. They take it as a personal identity at this point. That could be driving your anger. Are you grieving the loss of something? Are you depressed? Do you feel vulnerable in the emotional sense? And could it be that just generalized anxiety is driving that anger, and it's easier to feel anger than it is anxiety? All of these emotions will have certain levels of distress or eustress. There's distress, which is the kind of stress we don't like. There's eustress, which is the kind of stress we do like. Like if you enjoy skydiving, that's going to be stressful, but it's a good kind of a stress. But as far as anxiety about life and social things and emotional things, it's less painful to feel anger than it is anxiety. So is that what's going on? So I know I didn't answer your question directly, but I do want you to begin looking at what's going on behind your anger. That's the whole point of this, okay? And then I hope that that will get you started. So let's do this, guys. Since I'm always short on time, it seems, I'm going to be doing more of these live videos because I feel like I'm just getting too many questions to just keep ignoring them. I'm not actually ignoring them. It's just I really need to have 3 or 4 of me to keep up with the pace. But anyway, that's my problem, not yours. So let's do this with this video right here. We'll let this kind of be the foundation. If you have any questions, just put them in the chat notes over here on this video. And the next time I do a live video, which I hope to do real soon, I'm going to start doing these on a regular basis. I'll scroll through and pick one question. And oftentimes I get the same question just worded differently. And so I can probably answer 3 or 4 or 5 people at once. They're basically asking the same thing. So I will definitely look through the chat area later on, and I'll pick a question. And then sooner than later, very soon, I will address that one as well. So please feel free to put your question in there. And I promise to try to get to it as quick as I can. So we'll go ahead and sign off for now. I'm going to look over here at some of the questions now before I sign off. Can you explain the difference between level 2 and level 3 of ASD? Well, as you probably know, this is Crazy Bird. Level 1 is high functioning autism, which used to be called, and still is in some places, Asperger's syndrome. In fact, if you were diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome before the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual revised their criterion, then you still have that as your diagnosis. Level 3 was full-blown autistic disorder, and then level 2 is somewhere in between. So with respect to the different levels, what we're talking about is level of functioning in the social and emotional realm of things. You could have somebody with level 2 autism that functions very well in the workplace, as long as there's not a whole lot of socializing going on. They don't have to deal with people much. They might be the smartest person there. But when you get them away from their special interest and into something that's laden with a bunch of social and emotional nuances, they're a fish out of water. And that's when their symptomology really reveals itself. And that's when you can really tell that something's off. So they're very intelligent, super high in logic, and that's their saving grace. When it comes to dealing, especially with an NT wife, who is real high in social and emotional intelligence, and high in social and emotional skills, and high in social and emotional needs, and the ASD husband, to use this as an example, he's down here. I mean, he's smart, probably smarter than me, but he doesn't have the capability to match her in the business of emotional reciprocity, and that causes a lot of problems. One way to help the neurodiverse couples, where usually it's the NT wife and the ASD husband, the ones that I work with, although the inverse can be the case as well. One way to conceptualize this business of why there's so much problem in the marriage, and this is a gross oversimplification, but it is right there in the ballpark, and that is he is low in social and emotional needs, and she is high. So we have different domains of life that we have passion in, spiritually, physically, mentally, emotionally, socially, financially, vocationally. So let's look at each of those in turn. Spiritually, now people have a wide range of interests maybe not so much the people on the autism spectrum, but generally people have a wide range of interests, but they tend to favor one area. So we'll look at that first one with spiritual. So there are some people that spirituality is the main thing in their life. It is the big deal, right? They believe in prayer, they read the Bible, they go to church, they have a lot of friends and family in the church. They may go to church 2 times on Sunday, 1 on Wednesday, and they go to Sunday school and they go to prayer meeting, and that is their big focus, although they have other areas of interest too. Second one I mentioned was physical. So you have some people that's the big deal. They're always really meticulous with their diet. They work out every day, sometimes twice a day, and they're real keen on making sure that they have some muscle and that they stay lean, and they basically live at the gym, and that's their big deal. Health. Mentally was the next one, and this is not necessarily, I'm not tying this into mental health, I'm tying this into cognitive exercises. So some people, school is the big deal. Lifelong learners, they call them. And they go to school all the time. Even when in their 40s and 50s, they're always taking some classes. They're always reading. They're always investigating and learning. Learning is fun for them. And so they're always in learning mode and always trying to do cognitive exercises. Emotionally was the next one I mentioned. For these individuals, connection is super important. Sharing emotions, talking about emotions, give and take in conversation, going deep into one another. Is how did you feel about that? Or what was that experience? A lot of conversation about the little nuances of what's going on in somebody else's life. So emotional connection is huge there. Socially, some people, that's the big deal for them. They've got their clubs, they have their organizations, they have their teams. They're always connecting with people. They go out. She may go out with her girlfriends quite frequently, and they always go to the same place. And so being social is the big deal. The other thing I mentioned was financially. So for some people, making money is the big deal. That's the primary thing. I mean, they have other areas of interest and they care about their family and all that too, of course, but that's the main thing. I got to have money coming in. Oh, there's this particular project I can do to maybe bring more money in. Or how can I climb the ladder over here? Maybe start my own company. Or how can I monetize this? Or how can I streamline that? How can I take this particular thing and turn it into something to make money? So money is always on their mind, making money. And then the last one I mentioned was vocational, and that is this individual, their work is the big deal. Their job is, they're kind of course, they may be married, they value their wife and everything, but they're kind of married to their work, and their work is their partner. Their work is their partner. And so what we have, I got animals, a couple cats and a couple dogs who are waiting for breakfast here. So that's their big deal, work. They live for work. They're workaholics in some cases. So you have the NT wife who is real heavy in the social and emotional department. That's her big deal. Then you have the guy who's heavy in the vocational department. So she needs a lot of connection, ongoing, and that connection needs to be deep. He's more preoccupied with work. So you see the dichotomy there. You can see why this is not working out well. He doesn't need a whole lot of emotional, social connection. He just doesn't need it. And in many cases, doesn't even want it. She desperately wants it. And she keeps trying to nag him to connect, using nagging as a sarcastic word, which pushes him even further. It makes him want even less of a social and emotional connection. So she's keeps trying to get him to connect, and the more she tries to get him to connect, the more he wants to disconnect because he's just not wired that way. So anyway, that's the long-winded way of telling you what's going on in this neurodiverse marriage. He does not need social and emotional connection much, unless it's work related, unless it's, something to do with completing a task. Then he will need to have conversations with people and meeting of the minds and whatnot. But as far as a social emotional connection, purely for the sake of connection, doesn't need it, doesn't even want it. So she never gets it. And so she complains, and now he even wants it less. So I hope that makes sense. What do? We got to find a compromise. How do you find a compromise? I don't know. I would have to find out what your unique situation is there, because I've kind of overgeneralized here. Anyway, think of it like that. She needs a huge amount of social and emotional connection. He doesn't need it. And so there is the tug of war. And then sometimes she gives up trying to pursue him to get the connection, and she stops trying. And now we're really in trouble because she's resentful, and now he is tired of being in trouble all the time, and now we got a real mess going on. So my term, instead of masking, is mimicry. You have mimicked what you felt like was typical, appropriate behavior. It's like, I'm not sure exactly what to say or do in this particular situation, but I'm witnessing them say and do things in the same situation, and it seems to work for them, so I'm going to copy that. In the case with you, assuming you have ASD level 1, that's just a really fucking smart thing to do. That was a very intelligent move on your part. And I would say, don't you ever throw that away. That's a skill that you have cultivated very well, and you want to keep it. All people do that to some degree. So I don't want you to think that, well, because I have to act, that there's something wrong with me or somehow I'm defective or flawed. No. You are an individual who thinks differently. We'll call it autism, but you're living in a neurotypical world. If you only spoke English and you were forced to live in Russia and you didn't know the language, you would pretty quickly figure out a few things to get by so that people didn't get mad at you, so that they didn't get irritated with you when they're trying to talk to you and you don't understand much of what they're saying, and you notice that they get annoyed with you when you don't understand them, and somebody else comes up to talk to you in Russian, and they're trying to get a point across, and you don't understand them, and you notice, okay, when people come up to me and try to connect with me and I act as if I don't understand what they're saying, which I don't, they get upset with me. So I'm going to act as if I understand. I'm going to pretend like I get it. And that's a survival mechanism that you had to have. Thank God you have it. Then the other piece of this equation was, how can I just be true to myself? When do I turn this on? When do I turn it off? There's no shame in having this disorder. It's more widespread than you know. There is more tolerance now than there was even 10 years ago. We know that this doesn't mean that somebody is retarded or stupid or narcissistic or sociopathic. That's outdated, old school myths. That's by the wayside for the vast majority of society today. So there's nothing wrong with divulging, well, I'm just going to use the term blind spot. There's nothing wrong with divulging your blind spots to the people that are important to you. I'm going to make up an example that may or may not apply, but hopefully it will help you understand. You could say to somebody that you trust, being around this large of a crowd with all this noise really stresses me out, and so if I'm acting a little off, just to let you know, really have sensory overload right now.
So one common question that comes up from neurotypical spouses is, why does my autistic spouse prefer tasks over socializing? Well, to answer this question, we first need to look at the concept of weak predictive ability. If one has the ability to predict, he or she can come up with an educated guess about what may happen in the near or distant future. That is, some outcome is expected. But this ability is not necessarily based on experience or knowledge. Prediction is a skill that allows us to generalize. In other words, since the occurrence of situation A resulted in outcome B, then a situation similar to A will likely result in an outcome similar to B. Prediction not only affords quicker and more accurate reaction, but also a more efficient neural coding. Now, people on the autism spectrum have poor predictive abilities. In other words, they have great difficulty predicting future events. Another function of prediction is to fill in missing information. For example, if the driver in front of you veers his car sharply to the left and then to the right, you might predict that he swerved in order to avoid hitting something in the road. The autistic person's impaired predictive ability means impaired filling in of missing information for perception and action. So what does weak predictive ability have to do with a preference for tasks versus preferring to be with people and socializing? Well, since people on the autism spectrum have to live every day with the uncertainty inflicted by their poor predictive skills, they tend to favor relatively predictable and precise events and tasks. So as a result, they prefer dealing with facts, figures, objects, and so on, which are more predictable, instead of with people, which are less predictable. And I think you would agree that people are very unpredictable. So research, engineering, computers, other things that involves facts, figures, and objects have a much greater appeal to individuals who don't like a lot of unpredictability in their life. Due to difficulties with generalizing skills, people on the autism spectrum have a lower tolerance for unpredictability and complexity. They argue that figures, facts, objects, and associated tasks are predictable and simple, whereas people are not. Now, this is a message to the neurotypical spouses out there that are trying to make sense of their autistic spouse's need for obsessions and repetitive behaviors. So the reasons that people on the autism spectrum develop obsessions can be varied and many. One of the things that goes on is it helps them cope with the uncertainties of daily life. It can help them to relax. It provides order and predictability because, as you may or may not know, the day-to-day routine for individuals on the autism spectrum is highly unpredictable. So that's why they prefer routines and basically thrive and crave and demand structure. Plus, they get a lot of enjoyment just from taking a deep dive on one special narrow area of interest. And also, if they have difficulty socializing, they will often use their special interest as a topic of discussion so that they can kind of fit in. So repetitive behaviors also serve a function as opposed to a dysfunction. Some people, when they are anxious, will revert to some repetitive behaviors. Sometimes people on the autism spectrum need to increase sensory input, and sometimes they need to reduce sensory input. So an attempt to reduce sensory input could be the result of needing to distract oneself from sensory overload. And one example of needing to gain sensory input could be if the individual is bored or needs some kind of a distraction to reduce anxiety. So there is numerous reasons for obsessions and repetitive behaviors. Just know that routines are very much anxiety reduction strategy for people with ASD. So set routines, times, particular routes and rituals all help the individual to make order out of an otherwise chaotic life. So you, as a neurotypical spouse, need to understand that your autistic spouse will have a strong preference for routines and sameness. He's not going to like change, especially surprise change. He's not going to want his routines to be disrupted. So please don't take that personally, or you can take it personally if you want to, but you're not going to get it changed. So predictability is an anxiety reduction strategy, and obsessions and repetitive behaviors help establish predictability. I got a statement from an NT wife, and she says that my ASD husband can't see the forest for the trees. Well, it is a common trait among autistic individuals that they see parts instead of the whole. And it's a problem in some settings, especially of a social and or emotional nature, but it's a terrific attribute in other areas. For example, it's an attribute if you're looking for deep space anomalies, such as an astronomer, or if you're looking at unique cells, like a lab technician would, or if you're looking for differences among species, as a biological researcher would, or if you're looking for particular qualities of objects, for example, as a gemologist, antiques appraiser, or art historian. So it is hard for them to see the big picture when it comes to social and emotional nuances,
But with things of a non-social nature, seeing the trees rather than the forest is actually a bonus.
So, a quick message to the autistic husbands out there. Your neurotypical wife's feelings are a fact. If she has particular emotion going on inside of her, that emotion is a fact. For example, let's say that she lost her father recently, and she was grief-stricken at the loss of her father. That sense of loss, that feeling of grief is literally measurable if they were to do a brain scan. So that feeling is a fact. If she says, for example, I'm feeling sad that I don't get some of my intimacy needs met, that feeling is a fact. And you might say, well, Mark, she said, I feel that you don't love me. And I do love her. That's not a fact. You're right. Because if she says, I feel that you don't love me, that's not a feeling. That's a thought. So sometimes she will say, well, I feel such and such, and it's technically not a feeling, it's a thought. So her thoughts are not necessarily facts, but her feelings are, and so are yours. So when she's expressing her feelings, don't view it as, oh, she's so emotional, and oh, that can't be true. You don't feel that way. No, I'm sure she's not lying about her feelings. If she says she feels a certain way and she's actually using an emotion rather than a thought, she's not lying. That's what's going on. So when she's talking to you about her feelings, don't chalk it off as just a bunch of psychobabble with no factual basis. If you're feeling a particular way, let's say you're feeling mad at her, and I say, no, you don't feel mad. That's not reality. No, you would say, by God, I am mad, and it is a fact that I'm mad. So you understand now that feelings are facts. So when you enter a neurodiverse relationship and then on to the neurodiverse marriage, it's a lot like a boxing match and getting in the boxing ring. Some people play by a different set of rules. They may butt heads, they may knee you in the groin, they may step on your foot. So some people are going to abide by the standard boxing rules and some are not. They might hit below the belt, they might push you into the ropes, all kinds of things. And you have to know that this is just human nature. It's not just the experience that you're having in a neurodiverse marriage. If you think broadly, you run into people who don't play by the rules in general. If you're walking down the street and you trip over a rock, you don't get angry at the rock. So people are a lot like rocks that get in your way. They are, in a sense, obstacles from time to time for you. They have their own nature, and that nature isn't yours, and it's going to clash with you sometimes, and that's just what it means to be a human in general, but you may experience this to a larger degree in the neurodiverse marriage. So are you going to complain that people have a nature where they have an ego, or they can be passive-aggressive, or they cannot play by the rules, or they have weak moments and, quote, misbehave, unquote? And then in your constant complaining, you put yourself in a chronic disadvantage because you're draining yourself of a lot of energy that could be better used for other things. You're draining yourself with all these useless negative emotions, and you're not playing proper defense against your opponent, if we want to run with this boxing analogy, because you're all consumed with this kind of personalizing the situation, that this person shouldn't be doing these things, they shouldn't be hitting me, they shouldn't be getting in my way, they shouldn't be trying to defend themselves, they shouldn't be engaged in self-preservation, they shouldn't have their own fears and worries and anxieties. So instead, you have to create some distance between you and your opponent. And you have to do that in a very smart and intelligent way. That's called healthy emotional detachment. Not just your neurodiverse marriage, but other people in general. They're going to play a little dirty from time to time, and they're going to hit you, and it's going to hurt. But you don't whine and complain. You just figure out how you're going to defend yourself better. And one of the ways you defend yourself is not necessarily to hit back, but not make yourself vulnerable by putting yourself in harm's way time and time again. Or having very mature and convincing arguments that influence the other person to perhaps change their behavior.